His frayed fur and lonely eyes gave her the impression that he was just another neglected creature, the kind of stray you see after being fed. Occasionally forget, but as soon as she gave him his first piece of food, the universe changed, and she unwittingly entered a tale that was much bigger, wilder, and more remarkable than. Every day as the city released the final stress of the working day and permitted her to experience whatever she had ever known. Its streets to experience that strange silence that only occurs in the dim light between dinner and school bells. Tables. A little girl named Lily would walk home in the deliberate, silent footsteps of someone who had. The benefit of remaining unseen in a world too crowded, too preoccupied, and too busy was something she discovered far earlier than she should have. Loud to hear a youngster stroll with her head down and her voice malleable. Every day, they took the same old path past the bakery, where the aroma of cinnamon clung to the pavement like a pledge that she would never have the money to sample anything other than the ancient bookshop that had passed the spot where street artists used to perform is now silence, then nothing at all, and finally always. Shadows came early through the small alley behind her building where the concrete was fractured and the globe seems to completely forget itself, if only for a brief instant, in that. She first noticed him snuggled against the walls of the forgotten strip of silence where the walls murmured of rust and rain, sitting quiet and motionless, a dog with fur the color of storm-damaged riverbanks, and eyes that kept her look with the kind of quiet patience that did not beg or panic. Steadfast clarity that allows you to feel seen for who you are rather than how you seem. She remained motionless beneath the armor and the commotion, but something little and delicate that had withstood the wounds of a life half-heard reached inside her, retrieved the half-sandwich she had stored in her backpack, not for anyone to eat, squatting, slowly extending her arm, and setting the meal a few steps away from, anticipating appreciation, but not anything else, possibly just the moment of realization between two creatures who understood what it was to be ignored, what Lily was unaware of, and what she could never have predicted in that. The fact that this dog was ragged, mute, and still was a moment of simple silent grace, not who he seemed to be, and that the route she had just taken would take her directly into a man's life, whose fortune had the power to alter skylines, but whose spirit had been yearning for, in order to find something much more valuable in the days that followed that initial meeting, a fleeting instant that is inconspicuous to the naked sight, but so silently changing a girl's heart who had spent her entire life observing the knot because she felt obligated, not because she saw it as a task or a mission, but rather because of something she couldn't quite describe. Why I was drawn to that peaceful presence with eyes that never begged in fur like winter dirt, trembled, and only ever requested the exact amount that was given to the dog that she had not yet dared to name, never moaned, never barked, and never moved initially. Instead, he would just wait still, but never. The stillness of something made his body tighten, and he met her eyes without difficulty or anxiety, and only after she had bent down and extended her hand, sandwich, or the crusts of whatever food she had saved, he would get up and move towards her with the purposeful elegance of a creature who had learned to accept kindness only when it came in a subtle way. And he was aware of both betrayal and trust. Lily started talking to him, not first in complete phrases or in any manner that implied dialogue, but in ramblings of ideas expressed out loud to no one in particular, much like a toddler might speak more steadily in a whisper until the alley behind her building was more than simply a place to hide or take a shortcut. It was a sanctuary, a place where she could no longer remain unseen since someone, even however, he was unable to talk and was listening as she described the teacher in school, who chastised her for thinking about the boy who shoved her, and the girl with the flawless hair who teased her shoes, her books from her desk, and chuckled as she leaned over to retrieve them. Although the dog didn't respond, Lily sensed a change in herself, as the only reaction was the unwavering stare of someone who wouldn't turn away. She saw things when a window in a stale room cracked open, giving an air she didn't know she needed. About him as well, how his fur, although being knotted, was spotless in places like someone had, after brushing it gently, He noticed that his collar was disappeared, but it had left a thin line of smoother hair around his neck. Shivered slightly when some engines ran or when footfall echoed on damp street, but never at. When she told him things she had never stated out loud before, he was never impressed by her voice or the shaking of her hands. But something changed on the sixth day when she turned the corner and felt the familiar weight of a plastic sandwich. Bag in her hand, she noticed that he was already waiting, but a man was standing at the alley's edge was too far away to touch. But it was close enough to see someone wearing an expensive-looking dark overcoat. For this area of town, watching something calculated while holding a phone to his ear, and he turned abruptly and talked into the phone with an abrupt tone when he saw her, and their eyes briefly connected. She sensed the urgency but couldn't hear it, so she left without saying anything to the dog. Hadn't moved, but Lily had. That day, she took a step closer, not only physically but instinctively. She felt something tighten inside of her, not out of fear but out of a sense of protection. Had never met before, and he slowly leaned against her, getting closer than ever. Placing his head on her knee, he helped her forget the cold, the alley, the darkness, and everything save the silent miracle of being selected, even though she was unaware of the person at the time. She had no idea why he had been observing that man, but she felt something as deep and ancient as intuition. She recalled that she had just entered a situation that was much more complex than a stray dog. That night, long after she had come home and the weight of her school bag had been lifted, she performed a daily act of kindness. Swapped for the more somber silence of her tiny bedroom with a view of the alley, Lily sat by the window, saying her name and, despite the fact that the day had ended similarly to all others, with dinner consumed in solitude and schoolwork partially completed, her mother, another shift, had already fallen asleep in the adjacent room after working too long and too hard. But something had changed. Something was now agitated and unsure in her chest, pulsing beneath her ribs like a question that yet lacked words. She repeatedly relived the scene, the man in the coat, the fleeting look. The more she considered it, the more she realized that he had vanished as swiftly as he had appeared. Much different if someone like him had discovered it. And, as she observed the shadows extending across the brick walls beneath her, she couldn't get rid of the impression that someone had stepped through a door that had been discreetly opened. Through it. And the following day, she came back with a sandwich in her backpack, as usual. As she got closer to the alley, she felt a little squash from the weight of her books, and her heart was beating a little quicker than normal. She was afraid that the dog would be there, but she was also afraid that he would be, and that there was something about the world they had made in that small, deserted area might not be exclusive to the two of them anymore. But when she turned, he was seated in the same place as usual, doing the same serene thing, maintained the same vigilant gaze as if nothing had changed, and she exhaled more deeply than she realized because of the relief that filled her chest. She knelt and reached inside her bag, her shoulders slightly lowering, but this time, while he ate, she saw something different. There was a slight metallic sheen around his neck, hidden beneath the thick layer of fur that she had previously been afraid to touch, unmistakably golden despite being dimmed by filth. And when she leaned closer, she was cautious not to. The type with rabies certifications and numbers, but a tiny pawn-carved piece in the shape of an elaborate medallion. It's heavy-looking, like something you wouldn't find at a pet store, but it was designed and much of the surface had been worn or scraped, but one letter was still discernible in the middle, V. She didn't need to touch it because the dog raised his head and gazed at it as soon as she did, not with bewilderment or panic, but with a calm alertness that briefly gave her the impression that he was attempting to figure her out, as if he had been waiting for her to notice at last, and before she could say anything, before she asked the questions out loud, which were already piling up behind her teeth, he did. He got up, completely turned, and started to walk, something he had never done before, slowly and purposefully at first, as if to see if she would follow, and he paused when she hesitated, his heart pounding, glanced back once, and gave a. She followed him when he gave her a quick wag of his tail that was assured but not excited or eager. Down a short flight of stairs in the alley across the side street that she had never noticed before, her trainers just, her breath, held without intending to, made a sound on the wet concrete before eventually escaping into a tiny courtyard. Between buildings, where a lone bench was situated beneath a corroded lamp, and vines coiled themselves up the walls like veins. The dog stopped at the bench, sat, and waited after seeing a post that flickered feebly against the gray sky. Mostly hidden by ivy, it was carved into the stone wall behind the bench. Plaque. She pulled the leaves away, and the words were written in brass letters that had been tarnished by years of smog and rain. She gazed at the image of Victor's buddy, guardian, in the center of her household. Give the medallion to Victor V, and all of a sudden, the image of the man in the dark coat, including his face and the expression in his eyes, returned with stunning clarity. He looked at the dog with recognition rather than curiosity, and she sat. She whispered the dog's name out loud, while slowly lowering down on the bench with her fingers still on the plaque. Looked up, and that night he smiled for the first time, genuinely and undeniably. Lily stayed up much later than normal, cuddled up under the same patchwork blanket she had been using ever since she was. Just like tea, the city sounds hummed softly outside her window. The soft sound of the radiator's erratic lullaby had caused a profound and irreversible change within her. That even the silence felt different. It was no longer empty or remote, but rather packed with, implying that each gust of wind outside was bringing a fragment of a tale she had only just started to realize as she kept thinking about the plaque with the dog Victor's name and how she could pronounce it. Now state with confidence that it was her memories, not chance, that had brought her there. Something much more profound than instinct. And the way he had gazed at her had left her feeling neither like a child nor a rescuer, or even a friend, but rather someone who was selected or who had inadvertently entered the heart of life. That, up until now, had been dispersed around alleyways and sidewalks and left unanswered. For the first time, she pondered who had put that plaque and why it had been concealed beneath ivy, and it's evident how intelligent a dog like Victor is. Something evidently once, loved beyond description, had become forgotten in a back lane of the city that never gave it much thought. She was unable to forget the man in the coat, and she was able to observe what it was trampling underfoot. Presence no longer seemed accidental. Rather, it signaled the start of something the following day, motivated by something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Lily went back to the courtyard carrying a notebook and pencil instead of food, and the kind of resolve that comes from the minute you are born, the kind that only a young person can possess without regret. Understand that the world is hiding something, and that you have been given a piece of it in some way. His eyes were sparkling, and his posture was serene before her, as if he had anticipated her arrival. When she sat next to him, and she took out her notebook and started recording every detail of their journey, taking the medallion's shape, the plaque's text, and her writing. As though realizing that this was no longer about food or shelter, Victor put his head on her foot and breathed steadily. However, the pattern became more pronounced every day after school over the following week. Lily went back to the courtyard, and Victor met her there each day, sketched routes through alleys and back streets, past buildings with names, and started drawing past faded murals. After passing rusty iron fences that were too tasteful, the winner paused in front of structure, in contrast to a gigantic black glass skyscraper surrounded by a marble entrance was unlike anything they had ever seen, and protected by quiet, the type of structure that tolerated guests rather than actively welcomed them, the type that whispered significance by refusing to provide an explanation. The winner didn't yell, didn't cry. Instead, he just sat and raised his head, and when Lily followed his eyes, she noticed something carved into the polished white stone. The name V. Lancaster Holdings was written above the doors in slightly shimmering lettering against the darkening sky. Victor's ears perked up as he softly spoke the words out loud, and the distant thunder rolled low. It didn't make sense at all. At first, there was no connection between the icy steel of that tower and the cuddly dog that had taken over her life. But later she recalled something from a TV show that was on in the Bay about a man who was so private that there were very few pictures of him, whose empire spanned countries, whose wealth was described as incomprehensible, and whose only known scandal that was briefly discussed before being put to rest by lawyers and public relations teams had, unconfirmed, unexplained, and never mentioned again. Lily the lost dog stepped back from the entrance, The rain had started, initially lightly then, in thicker drips that smeared the pavement in irregular circles, while Victor stood quietly and steadily next to her as though she glanced at him and the tower while she waited for her to make a decision. And her pulse began to rush with wonder rather than terror for the first time, because she thought that perhaps this wasn't a story concerning a girl who discovered a dog. Perhaps this was a tale of a dog who wandered around in the days after their silent disclosure prior to the imposing glass structure bearing the Lancaster name that Lily had to pass through. The world with an elevated consciousness that was devoid of accountability and a feeling of inevitable, as if the fragments of a long-buried tale were now subtly under her feet. They were unavoidably coming together, while everyone around her went about their daily lives in ignorance. That every morning when she woke up, something she had forgotten had started to move again, not just with memories of school and household duties, but with the enduring mark of Victor's eyes from the way he had sat under that shining entry without moving, his head cocked, and that picture was more than the medallion, the plaque, or even the odd man in the coat who remained with her and tenderly touched her. She started to picture the city like a finger following the trace of something that had faded but not completely disappeared. Not in the same way as her childhood home, with its lanes, street lights, and voices that never beckoned to her name, but as an expansive, multi-layered map with incredibly close-by pathways, lurking just below the surface of the commonplace, prepared to be discovered via perseverance rather than force or good fortune. Focus and the calm assurance of someone who understands they are moving in the direction of something significant. Triumphs appear to notice this change as well, not in his composed and collected demeanor, but rather in the way he navigated space, never stepping too far ahead or faltering when she stopped to make notes or draw the locations. They continued to stay close enough to sense his presence without ever having to appear like a. When she started recording information on the buildings, it was a shadow created by memory and purpose rather than light. They went past the names inscribed on metal plaques, the way the sun shone on particular windows at particular times, and mailboxes, but they were for the story that was developing around her, a story that she hadn't requested to be a part of. Not because she thought she was the only one who could tell, but because she felt obligated to carry it now, worried about what would occur if nobody did. But despite all of this activity, taking notes and observing a single, every night, like a whisper right before bed, the question continued circling the periphery of her mind. Why had no one? If Victor had formerly belonged to Vincent Lancaster, a strong guy, come for him, sufficient to cover up stories and hide scandals under time and money, why had his dog wound up skinny and by himself in the alley behind Lily's flat, without a collar, an escort, or even a sign of? She couldn't believe he had been forgotten, not with those eyes or the training that was still in place, demonstrated by the way he sat when she was motionless, how he reacted to sharp noises, and how he previously looked both directions, crossing a street as if recalling guidelines that had been instilled in him by someone who had been concerned. So she looked, but loudly, not in front of others, but with the quiet perseverance of someone who has figured out how to navigate the world without drawing the sort of attention that raises too many questions. And what she discovered simply made the story a little more complicated. An ancient digital archive article about a reward for information regarding a law service dog linked to the Lancaster estate, thought to have never been stolen, was last spotted close to the Northern Hills. Nevertheless, the hunt came to a sudden end a few weeks later without any explanation, and the family declined to be interviewed. Press moving on without any pictures, updates, or resolutions. Just a place where a narrative can be told. Had been, and then, all of a sudden, it was evident that the victor had been captured, but who had stolen him? And why were the mysteries that lingered in Lily's mind like wet fog clings to windows? Because Victor would have been abandoned if someone had taken the time to remove him from such a location. Months later in an alley, it wasn't merely carelessness, it was deliberate, and that posed a risk not only to Victor, but also to her at this time. Yet when as she pieced together the clues in her old notepad, he lay at her feet, his breath steadying his eyelids, constantly following her with something that had the appearance of not being brave or believing, Whatever power had caused Victor to vanish, she could outsmart it because of something in her that she had started to develop every time he gazed at her, as though she were important. And after you've been seen that way once, you've been trusted in that sense. And even when the narrative gets dark, especially on a Wednesday, you don't leave. Afternoon, the type of cloudy, windswept day that made the city seem both calmer and more serene. When Lily first saw the car, a sleek low black sedan, she became extra vigilant. It wasn't as if even the weight of its motion had been designed to avoid leaving any marks. And even though it hadn't, she hadn't seen it pull up or drive away, but it had followed her straight, was parked across the street from the tiny supermarket, where she occasionally stopped for bread. Once more, she explained that the alley was always deserted, or at least first seemed to be. Her paranoia about the fact that wealthy guys like Vincent were everywhere in cities was unfounded. Lancaster most likely had bodyguards, drivers, and surveillance, but the part of her that had developed over years of cautious movement, learning to sense people's emotions before they spoke, and this was no accident, and their eyes before their words understood the distinction between coincidence and intent. Victor also noticed it. She could tell by the subtle shift in his physique and the way his ears tilted as they passed it. He silently, almost imperceptibly, moved between her and the street. He was never hostile or reactive, prepared as though, under the gentle weight of their time, the instincts he had previously been taught to follow were starting to awaken, similar to muscle memory awaiting authorization to reactivate. And that was when she discovered that someone else had begun observing her, and that she wasn't the only one following breadcrumbs. Whoever it was, they weren't making a concerted effort to be anonymous. They just wanted her to know. But why the question kept coming up? She reenacted every conversation, every location they had visited, and every hint of the name in the hours between school and sleep. Lancaster left in the building's architecture, and the more she examined, the more she realized how profoundly this. How many doors were covered by the man's quiet fingerprints, and how completely, through layers of influence and image, he had been able to shield himself from the outside world. But somewhere within all that, somewhere beneath the palace of silence he had constructed, the fitted suits, and the guarded press releases, there had been space for a dog named Victor throughout his childhood, a buddy that wasn't, a trophy from someone who had been important. And if that relationship had ever been, then there were only two possible explanations for the quiet that followed Victor's disappearance. Either something had happened that Vincent Lancaster was unable to discuss, or that something had occurred that he decided not to discuss, both of which were dangerous. However, one of them was guilty, and no matter how strong the wall, guilt had a way of leaking through crevices. So Lily, in an attempt to uncover the fracture, she began by asking a question at the library that caused the librarian to raise an eyebrow, but remained silent, sending an email to an address she discovered hidden on the Lancaster Foundation's website's contact page, wording her message as a courteous question regarding efforts to promote animal welfare and whether any programs have lately been canceled, attempting to sound inquisitive rather than probing. But what transpired the following day was what really convinced her that she had been heard cautiously hiding beneath a stone she had previously used to wait for her at the bench in the courtyard. She weighed down a page of her notes and found a plain, sealed envelope without a name or return address, and within one folded sheet of paper that has only 4. You're asking the incorrect question, with words typed across the center and no signature. No justification, but their words struck more forcefully than any danger could, because they implied redirection rather than denial or dismissal, as if someone watching or listening outside had decided to mentor her rather than stop her, which, in some way, she didn't realize that this was larger than her, larger than Victor, and possibly even larger than Lancaster himself. Share the note to anyone. She didn't mention anything out loud, but that night, while she was sitting next to Victor, her fingers brushed the faded fur behind his ears, her thoughts racing with questions and possibilities, and an odd sense that she mumbled something she hadn't said before since she had already passed a line from which she could not turn back. I don't know who I'm becoming in all this, she continued quietly, hardly even addressing him. But I guess I have to find. Victor didn't move, but he also didn't turn away, and occasionally that's Everything you require once she discovered the note, those four mysterious words typed neatly on a sheet of paper with no name, address, or indication of where it came from, but it held the undeniable gravity of each movement, which is slowed down a little by the weight of her ideas, which are never completely her own. Every moment of calm is now infused with the hum of possibility, disturbed by the feeling that she was being closely and silently watched rather than merely a girl following hints. She concealed the note under her mattress not because she expected anyone to find it, but rather because its above-ground presence gave her a sense of being watched that was much more intense than and every time her fingers touched. She felt the gradual tightening of something again as she folded the edge while making her bed or searching for a fallen pencil. Something in her life that is invisible but intentional and gradually increasing. Difficult to ignore, as those four words contain neither an explicit warning nor an attempt to scare her away. However, in some way, the note felt more grave and deadly because there was no threat, as if whoever had knew that Lily wasn't the kind of girl who would back down from something just because it got held in her hands. She attempted for a few days to act as though nothing had changed and to go about her daily habit of walking. Victor greeting the same weary neighbors along the same alleys and past the same shops, and her awareness of everything had become more acute, and she started to notice the repetitive automobile horns and the patterns of people's footsteps. 2 streets distant, the minute variations in Victor's breathing as they approached specific junctions, and above all, the way her own thoughts had started to flow more quickly and forcefully, as though something had been released from within. She had spent a large portion of her childhood being ignored by teachers, so she had never experienced what it was like to feel needed. Classmates, occasionally even her own mother, whose weariness frequently permeated their flat more thoroughly than her speech. However, she now felt a sense of urgency that wasn't there before, not out of fear or danger, but rather out of need to follow this thread, not for the excitement of it, but she was starting to think that she might be the only one who could win it all. He never pulled on the leash, never roamed, and never forced her to do anything. Sense of insecurity, but he was also observing, and the more time she spent with him, the more she saw that this was not even about the man who used to own him, but only about a misplaced pet. Something broken that someone had worked so hard to conceal somewhere, something bigger and far less defined. Late one night, money, silence, and distance made it difficult for her to sleep on her breast. Tight with incomprehensible inquiries, she ended up sitting on the fire escape outside her bedroom. Her legs drew near the window as the city spread out in front of them like a mechanism that she had only just started to comprehend, a system of walls, lights, and names that had all appeared to be permanent, and unconcerned until recently, when she started to realize how flimsy everything truly was. "I'm not sure what I'm intended to do next," she muttered into the darkness, the wind choking off her voice, needing to at least add a, but not expecting or even needing an answer. Whatever innocence had previously protected her from the consequences was now gone, and in its place came the gradual, relentless, realizing that once information is acquired, it cannot be forgotten. The winner remained motionless. He made that move without blinking, but his body pressed a little bit closer. Lily saw the reverberation of a commitment made in presence of loyalty rather than in words. And in that silent animal voice, "Whatever comes, I stay." She realized that the choice had already been made, not in a single, heroic moment, but over the course of 100 smaller ones. Every action made, every word written, every silent instinct that was unknowingly followed. Why? And that the only thing left to do was determine how, not whether, she would act. And if she could do so before the story consumed her completely. It started with a picture that was a little faded at the corners. Lily had taken an old donated biography from a shelf, and it was twisted from the wetness and sandwiched between 2 loose pages. With a tug of fascination she couldn't resist, the library's free take was drawn to the dusty cover and faded spine. Elucidate in the instant she opened it and let the picture fall on her lap. Her breath caught, not in astonishment, but more in the calm, acute realization that she had been searching for something she didn't know existed. The image, which showed a man standing, was printed on thick paper and was somewhat yellowed, indicating that it had not been taken lately. Alongside a younger Victor, his fur is more vibrant than his body, which is slim but similar too. Someone touching something priceless is a sign of connection rather than ownership. And even though the man's face was, despite being partially turned away, it was obvious that it was Vincent Lancaster. The world has never been able to witness Lily in such an unguarded moment of devotion. Spent several minutes staring at the picture, her fingers shaking just enough to cause her heart's corners to blur, throbbing with the odd rising sensation of a puzzle breaking. Not in finality, but in proof of what she had sensed from the start. The enormity of Victor's loss and the betrayal resonate beneath his serene. His occasional ability to recall locations she had never seen wasn't a hunch or a projection. Rather, it was genuine, and now. The question it raised was more startling than the evidence itself, even if it was documented. Why would this man have permitted the existence of this photograph if he had once loved this dog and knelt next to him? Had he released him, allowed him to disappear, and allowed the world to assume he was no longer angry? This question was the one that started to nag at her the most, clinging to her mind without any search or trace. Even in her sleep, which had become restless during meals and lessons, with dreams that resembled a door shutting behind him, followed by the silence. The cold and the prolonged silence. And every morning she felt more convinced that whatever had occurred to Victor wasn't a coincidence, wasn't a random event, and wasn't just the consequence of someone wished to undo anything that had been done due to carelessness or loss. The next hint came from a quiet, low voice rather than from study or surveillance. That greeted her as she left the library 2 days later was almost amused. Victor was strolling a little ahead with his head full of books when a man appeared behind the pillar, close to the gate, and remarked without introductory statement, "You've been asking good questions, the kind that make the right people nervous." She abruptly stopped. Her whole body froze in a sort of internal recoil, not from sudden fright, but rather in the manner that people freeze when they discovered that the man, who was tall and unshaven, had read aloud the script they were composing in secret. Wearing dark-rimmed glasses that reflected the wan afternoon light, and a coat that was too small for him, enough to hide his eyes, and despite his easygoing demeanor, his tone was too. The voice of someone who spoke only after mentally practicing each syllable twice was too exact. "I don't want to hurt you," he added, raising one hand as though to fend off an impending panic attack. "And I'm not here to stop you. Also, but I believe it's time you quit playing detective by yourself." She didn't answer, didn't come forward, and didn't flee. Victor was silent at her side, but totally aware of his body as he stood there, his hands tightening around the straps of her rucksack. "I worked for him once," the man remarked, adding that only a dog taught to respond to a single command may be, making an ambiguous gesture towards the skyline, where the Lancaster Tower was barely visible like a blade in the distance. Long ago, before everything was sanitized, he strained against the clouds. He took something out of his pocket and, without moving, held out to her a USB drive wrapped in a folded sheet of paper. He glanced over his shoulder once and then turned back, saying, "I don't have time to explain everything, but this will be helpful if you truly want to comprehend what transpired and what they buried." She still didn't. Victor only took one step forward, so she didn't need to move. Assertive, not warning, but evaluating, and the man knelt down and put the car on the sidewalk, stood, and left without saying anything else. Lily walked swiftly and silently around the corner and gazed at the item for what seemed like hours, but it was. The world around her probably held its breath for a few seconds as she leaned to get the paper, which was crackling softly. Only once she tucked the disc in her hand did the city's rhythm return. More than anyone else, she said in her coat pocket, "We're not invisible anymore." And for the first time, the night Victor licked her fingers, long after the windows of one by one, the neighborhoods had gone dark, and the city's gentle murmur had melted into the eerie silence. Curled up at her side like a living shadow, the USB drive little, designated exclusively for those who stay up and not Victor. On the covered top of her notepad, silent and somewhat metallic, emanating a presence much greater than what its weight should permit, as though the data it held had already started to shift. The room's atmosphere, she hadn't yet opened it. Not because she was worried about what she could discover, but because the moment before discovery had a hallowed quality to it, a breath that contained the strain of everything she wished to realize the seriousness of the situation and realize that there would be no going back if she passed this threshold. No running away into the safety of ignorance outside the wind. No acting like a little girl assisting a lost dog. Glided gently along the winding streets, rattling loose shutters and rubbing up against window panes, and somewhere a siren's cries in the distance may have once caught her attention, but the same queries that had sent the man how were now hardly audible over the steady pounding of her thoughts. He was well aware of how and why someone had finally selected her to be the recipient of what had been kept secret for so long. The aging laptop her mother used for work was groaning and waking slowly when she finally plugged the drive. Aged the documents laden with a glimmering doubt that reflected her own, and, without fanfare, a folder containing a number of documents and pictures was opened, and video recordings, each labeled with a clinical detail that spoke to, not of disorder, but of someone curating, not merely recording, but maintaining a. She viewed the first film, and for a brief moment, her breath caught as she revealed the true tooth that had previously been too hazardous to divulge. Nevertheless, the grainy video appeared to have been captured by a security camera in a huge, glass-lined room, walls with silver accents, and Victor Younger was positioned in the middle of the picture, brighter, as evidenced by Victor's stance, the faint shudder in his knees, and the way his eyes never left the. Something was wrong, but it wasn't explicitly violent, said the man sitting in the corner. She clicked, explosive but subtly incorrect in the way that power becomes when it is permitted to function without question. Between names she didn't recognize but whose titles carried correspondence across the files, reports, receipts, and Public Relations Liaison, Private Security Liaison, and Wait Director of Operations, Strategist, and the narrative became more incisive with each subsequent segment. Simply a dog mystery, but a complex web of choices, errors, and hidden harm, concerning a single occurrence that is repeatedly mentioned in Code Incident A17. The more she read, the more she realized that Victor hadn't just disappeared or been accidentally lost or stolen. Rather, he had been carefully and discreetly removed after seeing something he shouldn't have observed, or maybe after being a part of something that nobody had anticipated he would survive, and when the consequences got too untidy, too human. Thus it was decided to remove not just the event, but also the. Apparently, he was never meant to return, but he did, and when the dawn broke, he took her with him. Dim light on her bedroom walls peeling paint, and the faint sounds of morning stirred in the. Lily slowly shut down the laptop in the corridor beyond her door before turning to. Victor remained motionless and waited, his gaze fastened on her with the calmness of someone who had always known what she would discover and who had enough faith in her to continue. She didn't talk because she had nothing to say, but rather because their relationship no longer needed words, and instead she extended her hand, feeling the rise and fall of his back as she softly rested it on its curve. Breath under her hand, engrossing herself in the cadence of a life that had been cast aside and was now standing at the center of something much bigger than what they had both decided upon. And in that silence right before the world returned to its pace, she decided, quietly and without fanfare, that she would not let this tale end in quiet, knowing that she would find a way to overcome fear and strength to undo what had been done. Way to talk, even if no one was prepared to listen, because she was no longer terrified of the consequences of speaking the truth, just terrified of what would occur if no one had the courage to pay it when the time arrives. Unavoidable in every narrative that goes beyond the comfort zone where all that has been learnt, uncovered, frightened, and silently carried, starts to push outward at that very moment. Arrived on a Thursday afternoon when there was no wind and the air felt abnormally motionless, as if the world itself were preparing for something it couldn't yet handle. Every sound felt just a bit too loud. Name, but she had spent the morning rereading it since she knew it was coming. Files to absorb the weight of what she already knew, not simply the proof of intentional actions, rather than to obtain additional information. Erasure the icy efficiency widow's choices were not made by bad guys, but rather by suit-wearing individuals signed contracts that reduced live things to risks, liabilities, and statistics, and they talked softly. The number of points that had to be eliminated before they became inconvenient had increased. Quieter as well, not because he was afraid or because his trust in her had changed, but rather because he more than. Everyone appeared to realize that the purpose of passive observation was coming to an end as the mood changed, and that they would have to emerge from behind the silent and unassuming wall much sooner than each of them was prepared to do so. Into a fight they were unable to avoid. The man, not the Lancaster building, was the trigger. And the code, not from the heartless throb of the city, but from home from the little, dilapidated flat Lily had always considered her haven, the only location unaffected by the tale she had started navigating through server logs and alleys, and it occurred without any drama or noise in the most. It came in the most hazardous way possible, through the mailbox, and they allowed her to. Her name, first and last, are typed in sharp black on the return address without a stamp. Letters as if someone intended to make it plain that they were aware of her identity, residence, and everything. What she had been doing inside was a single sheet of paper with a devastating suggestion, but no frightening content, as it was straightforward. This isn't your struggle. Turn away. You're A. There was no demand, no signature, no warning of consequences, and the youngster wasn't a soldier, but that absence resembled the. It worked so well because it didn't try to frighten her away with loud noises like screams or sobs, violence or spectacle that attempted to remind her of her and shame her into silence. Helplessness to turn her back into the once invisible girl who was supposed to stay that way. But Lily was no. She was no longer invisible since the man in the glass had not picked her. Tower, not by a shadowy person tugging at strings in the background, but by Victor, who had silently left his story in her hands, who had accompanied her around every uncharted corner, who had guided her towards purpose rather than safety. And as she gazed at the message, despite the shaking in her chest, she kept her hands firm and recognized that she had over the last line, which divides. They were aware of her identity due to their curiosity, and she stopped caring that night. She went back to the Lancaster building to show them that she was still there, not to confront or blame them. She continued to move, observe, and be present as she walked straight down the major boulevard, visible in the daylight amid throngs of onlookers, glanced at her before turning away, unaware that they were walking past a female who had stealthily withdrawn the edge of a tail intended to stay buried. Therefore, she didn't need to stop in front of the entryway because the cameras caught her, and she was aware that they would report them, and that someone would need to decide once more, not just about her, but also about what came next. Later that evening, when she was sitting next to Victor on a rooftop under her voice didn't sound like hers, but rather like someone she had grown up with, and the sky was so clear that it seemed strange. She answered, not to him, unaware that they believe this story is about them. It's about what occurs when you leave someone behind and think about it, not to the breeze, but to the city itself. Victor moved slightly and pressed his head on her side, but the world won't remember it. And she realized then that they were actually in a confrontation, not just preparing for one. There are points in every story point that comes subtly with the inevitable rather than announcing itself, with drama or caution. When every thread had every question, it was like a flood coming back to shore. Lily was caught between knowing and acting while she was standing at the kitchen counter with the folded municipal, her breath caught between the weight of what it signified and the still-forming document, which was still warm from her hand, realizing that her only option was to complete the paper basic tan. There was no sense of urgency or dramatic discovery in the gray bureaucratics tone, but because of its harsh finality, it hit her harder than any yelled charge ever could. At the bottom of the bleak, teen-accurate scroll was the signature of a man who, at that very moment, had ceased being a mysterious, mythical, or rumored character who had evolved into someone much more terrible, someone who knew what. Regardless, she read the name again, 3 times, and didn't want to verify it. She had no choice but to take in the information and let it to seep into her bones. Decide because she Understand what it's like to gaze into the eyes of someone who has entire faith in you and still determined that you're. Even though the heat of that realization scorched behind her flesh, she still believed that silence was more valuable than their lives. Her calmer, colder, sharper self was awakening to another truth, and facing it was the only thing left to do. Directly, but in person, not for revenge or closure, but because tales like this don't finish in darkness. And she had seen too much, traveled too far, and understood the importance of the truth. She didn't inform her mother that she didn't talk to the man in order to let this one to be absorbed back into silence. She didn't try to alert, prepare, or explain herself to anyone about the code, because some decisions don't need acceptance, and certain routes, once selected, cannot be followed with another person. Therefore, packed in a plain package with his hands, a picture of him and Victor, and a file displaying his approval of the removal order, and a punishment that just served as a mirror of who you were before, without any accusations, rage, or threats. Loved him, but something had changed. No signature, no contact information, just the. She walked it to the edge of the Lancaster property and put it in the purest form of truth. Mailbox with unshakable fingers, and left without turning around, since she was more certain than. She knew that if anything remained in that tower with the ability to hear, it would do so. And if. For 3 days, there was nothing. No car, no message, and nothing else she could say would ever change anything. The street's calm vigilance remained unchanged, but on the 4th afternoon, she and Victor returned from school. She noticed the white package slipped under her door as she and her late son slanted low across the buildings. One line inside a car that is unlabeled and clearly intentional. Tomorrow at 4 p.m., the south entrance will be no more or less, so when the following day comes. It's weird. Lengthy hours were prolonged by the silent fear that permeates her expectation, and she dressed without. Contemplating, she put the original papers in her purse, took one more look at the picture, and put her hand on the weight of everything they had carried, the steadiness of Victor's presence, and the warmth of his back. Together and silently, they left a story rather than a girl and a dog. The walk towards the Lancaster building, which was done in purposeful stillness beneath the accumulating clouds of a sky so heavily clouded that it appeared to act as a lid on the summits of the glass towers. Holding was more like entering a new level of the city than it was like traveling through the one she had always known. The universe as a whole, where each step's weight carried the echo of all the questions she had asked, all the silences she had learned to decipher, and the truths she had discovered. Victor walked next to her, without dragging or pausing, keeping pace with the warnings etched into the breeze. Calm assurance of someone who knew they were going into something bigger than a structure. More tea. It was the hub of the internet, where all decisions, documents, and silences had been made. Bought. And it would now have to confront the exact thing it possessed for the first time. Tried very carefully to remove it. She didn't look up as she got closer to the south entrance, because she didn't want or need to. Provide the tower the joy of seeing her awe, as wonder had no place at this time, and was only there to serve a man with a clean uniform, and an enigmatic face who seemed to have seen much more than he ever mentioned looked at. She knew the message had been received, and the meeting had begun when she silently opened the glass door without saying anything. Not as a courtesy, but more as a reaction, and the quiet was more intense, heavier than the city air outside, filled with containment rather than absence, like a room designed to block out every sound that could spread the truth too far. And as she continued to look forward, her breath. She gently brushed Victor's back with her measured hand, not to reassure him, but to convince herself that this presence. They came into the room without introducing themselves, and this bond and tale were genuine. Office block, but not in the traditional sense. Rather, it was a private sanctuary where each line was chiseled out of steel and constraint. Every carefully chosen item exuded a presence so profoundly crafted that it almost. Vincent Lancaster, who was tall and well-groomed in slate gray. His temples were silver, and his eyes met hers without hardening or narrowing. Instead, they held for a minute without anyone speaking. There was a long pause before he said, without greeting or gesture, in I questioned whether you would truly come, but she didn't. Her voice was so polished and flawless that it sounded molded rather than uttered. Reply with a hello. But instead of grinning, she reached in her bag and took out the folded document that had attempted to make Victor a problem, the one with his signature at the bottom, be erased, put on the table between them, and flattened with one hand while Victor sat quietly next to her. I read your command, she replied in a calm, low, precise voice, her eyes never leaving the man who had previously referred to him as his own. You sent him away, but you didn't lose him. Lancaster glanced at the page, then at her, then briefly at Victor, and there was a flicker in his eyes, not regret or recognition, but a colder calculation shattering beneath the. I protected him from the pressure of inevitable events, he murmured at last, although his words were gentle. They echoed across the room like metal on stone because of what they intended to do with him. Yet you let him go, she said, her voice piercing the air like a truth-honed sword without rising or quivering. You never returned, and the ensuing quiet was not void but rather filled with everything that could not be justified, and she saw him for the first time since she started her unfeasible story, truly viewed him as a figurehead, a symbol, or a ghost rather than as the inaccessible guy in the glass tower. Someone who formerly had a strong affection for something, and when it got inconvenient, when it started to pose a threat of dragging anything actual out from behind the wall he had constructed, he made the decision to, quieter now, almost human, he murmured, "Go now. You're not here for answers." She nodded in a gesture rather than a threat. "And you're here to finish something. Of disobedience, but also as recognition, since that's precisely what she had come to pass. There are rare and unchangeable times in life when every breath, every decision, every action, whether silent or defiant, is done with the heart in mind. Of a secret reality, come together so strongly that the we and must unavoidably explode outward as clarity rather than chaos. And that was the exact moment that Lily stopped standing as a girl who had strayed too deep into another person's narrative, but as the one individual who had brought the truth to the location where it was impossible to ignore, the chamber with its immaculate glass and stone walls. Quiet in its sterile accuracy appeared to falter under her weight, not because she was powerful she carried memory and fidelity, and men admire things that aren't contained by systems or signs. The creature she carried was one that the guy in front of her had once selected, once trusted, and then he had lost a crucial time in his life when it really mattered, like an awkward statement in a. Victor's well-practiced voice was immobile. He didn't growl or bark. He sat motionless next to her, breathing steadily and with a relaxed physique. And yet his eyes remained fixed on Lancaster's face, bringing with them the complete, unblinking weight of all that had previously bonded them, all that had passed between them, and all that had been broken when allegiance was met with silence rather than safety. Lancaster, too. His voice no longer carried when he talked, yet his credit did not turn away. It nearly cracked under the cool assurance of a guy in charge of the space. He said, "I tried to protect him," hardly perceptible under the weight of what had now come back to him. But it sounded different in front of the person who knew its shape, quieter this time, as though he were repeating the deception to himself. Lily could see that he went on. "I had no choice, too intimately to be fooled." Behind a well-practiced stoicism and under the fitted jacket, the first signs of something genuine about a man, recalling the instant he turned away and understanding. Maybe for the first time, the obligation had not been absolved by turning away, but just postponed its reckoning. She didn't react angrily, didn't yell, didn't point a finger, or tell him what he already knew, but instead she took the picture out of her bag, placed softly on the table between them, the image of an aged, crumpled, yet intimately vivid piece. Younger Lancaster was kneeling next to Victor, his hand on the dog's head with obvious compassion in his eyes, not worn out or frigid, but a friendly, open human being, and she then put the order next to it, the one bearing his signature, the one that made that identical creature a file, a throwaway item that needed to be moved. "I didn't come here to hurt you," she replied discreetly in a quiet but steadfast. "I came here to remind you." Silence returned, But this time she was not protective or frigid. Rather, it was the quiet of something starting to reveal a long-buried creature. Lancaster, drawn back to the surface by the presence of someone who would not allow it to stay buried, examined the documents and remained silent for a while. But when he eventually looked up, not at her, but at Victor, there was something odd in them, something that isn't quite developed yet, but is attempting to be sorrowful. He was unable to identify a guilt that was too big for words that I could use. He said, "Protect him from them." And after it was over, I persuaded myself that it was better for him to vanish than for him to forget. The victor stood slowly and deliberately, not suddenly, but with the weight of someone who had heard what they had been waiting years to hear. Not because they thought apologies were necessary, but because late acknowledgement is nevertheless important, and to the surprise of everyone but Lily, Victor moved forward, and he moved slowly, steadily, and silently across the room, and came to a halt before Lancaster, who was motionless in his seat, observing in breathless silence as the thing he had previously exterminated reappeared, not in rage, but with. The victor rested his head with dignity and the unsaid grace of one who has already forgiven what had never been acknowledged. Softly on Lancaster's knee, and everything shattered in the silence that ensued, which was dense with all that was not spoken, yet reverberating with the subtle, indisputable sound of something that had before been broken, starting slowly. I didn't break the quiet that blossomed between a man and the animal he had once owned in order to reassemble, flung into the dark because she had the instinct of someone who has come to the end of a shattered story after walking its length. The last shuddering thought that this moment was not hers to control, but rather his to meet and Victor's to present to Lancaster. His hand remained in midair, seemingly unsure of whether to reach or back away, and he gently lowered it until it leaned on Victor's head without hesitation, without remorse or conceit. However, when it is at last permitted to be viewed once more as what it was, something genuine, something whole, and he did not speak or cry when he returned, not to be erased, but to be honored. However, Lily witnessed the gradual breakdown of something inflexible inside him, the submission not to pardon, but to the knowing that certain losses may only be acknowledged and not undone. That sometimes rebuilding isn't the most effective thing someone can do, but remain motionless long enough to let what was lost to return to them, even if only briefly, as a creature who, later, when they left the premises without being escorted or dismissed, but were let to do so, they still recalled the positive aspects of them, to depart as they had came, quietly, without any fuss or explanation. Lily had no sense of victory or success as a result of what had transpired between them, but something more subdued, something that sank into her chest like the end of a long-awaited chapter. Victor walked peacefully behind her, but it took him too long to find the last page. He didn't have to look back, since what he had come to get was never a house, an apology, or even a name. Came for his closure, and in the weeks that followed, he at last received it. Did not go back to its previous state, since it was unable to do so after everything that had been said and seen had been carried. However, it did discover a new rhythm that was influenced by Victor's head resting on her lap. As they sat together in silence on calm evenings, the knowledge was illuminated by the morning sun shining through the window. Not because she had to, but because she couldn't. She had done something that most people wouldn't dare, and that more. So everything became the lifeblood of her days, not headlines or justice as the world defines it, declarations or dramatic reckonings, but the unspoken assurance that she had previously been selected by a creature who, together, brought each other back to life after being forgotten by the world. If this story touched you, you briefly experienced the silent strength of being seen, the weight of allegiance, or the fortitude required to, when the world has turned away, stand by someone and allow them to remain with you as a reminder of what really counts, since there are innumerable silent tales of animals in nooks we frequently ignore. People of moments that nearly disappear while they wait for someone to notice, care, or decide to be kind while it's easier to leave. So continue to be inquisitive, stay accessible, and be the person who doesn't turn away, And if these tales speak to you or cause you to feel something, please subscribe to our channel. Because there is more to this narrative, more truth, more heart, and more of what the world needs. Truly has the power to alter everything.